So, welcome to the universe of Astro. Today, I'd like you to take on a journey, and I want to start with you on a planet called Svelte. And from Svelte, we will be traveling to the planet called React. And today, for our Vue.js meetup, we will be landing on the planet Vue.js. So this is something that really got me caught about Astro. It was some magic moment at first when I learned about Astro, and I really wanted to know how is this framework working. And let's jump into the presentation now. So using Astro. So welcome to the first meetup this year from the Vue.js Frankfurt meetup. And today, let's see what we will be showing you. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jan. I'm 36 years old, currently working as a DevOps engineer and doing web development since a long time. I remember that I did my first steps with HTML with a magazine named Bravo Screen Fun, I think. And with an early version of self HTML. And 2007, I think I started my business career in web development in the area of e-commerce. And today I would say I'm a full stack developer. And yeah, I'm really passionate about new technologies. So when something like Astro comes along, I need to learn it, understand it, and I'm also passionate about learning how to learn. Mindfulness, and hopefully at some point also can do sports again, like soccer and volleyball. And that's it from my side. So what we are going to talk about today. So first of all, I'd like you to tell you on a high level what is Astro. And after that, I'd like to show you some goals of Astro. After that, we will look at mechanisms of the framework and go also into demonstrations. And I'd like you to show you the project structure of an Astro project, how the routing is working, and so on. And then I'd like you to show you some things you should know about when using Astro, or you're interested in Astro. And at the end, there's a future outlook, what is planned and will be possible come. So Astro is currently in an early beta version. I think it's 0.13.3 currently, but it gets daily new releases and new bugs will be fixed and so on. And at the end, I'm happy to get some feedback. Oh, I saw a typo directly, feedback. And I'm open for questions, which I will, if I can't answer them directly, I will write them down and give them as a feedback on the meetup event. And then we can also have an open discussion. So what is Astro? Astro is a static site generator. And if you know Vue.js static site generators, there's Nuxt.js, for example, which has a more like server rendering part, dynamic server rendering part. There's Gridsome and there's VuePress. These are the frameworks that I mainly know for Vue.js, but Astro has a total different other approach. So with Astro, as you saw in the welcome slide, you can bring your own JavaScript framework. So it's not only for Vue, but it's good if you decide on using one framework. For sure, you can use all frameworks on one page. And Astro implements something like which is called an island architecture. I will explain that later on. What totally differentiates Astro from other frameworks is that it's an HTML first built tool. So at first, there's zero JavaScript, and we will see that later on as well. And Astro is based on Snowpack, which is a module bundler, which is comparable to Parcel, Rollup, Webpack, and heavily relies on ES modules. What are the goals of Astro? On a high level, I would say pretty generic, make better and faster web pages. But what Astro wants to reach is bringing the power of web applications and the expression of possibilities of JavaScript together, and at the same time ship as less as possible through the browser to the customer to get really the simplicity and speed of static HTML, simplicity of web pages, and to get this all in one tool. And at the same time, Astro wants to bring a nice developer experience to us. So let's look into the mechanisms of Astro. First, I'd like to show you a little bit the project structure. Then I will talk a little bit about the Astro files, pages, and components. I will show the Markdown support, how hydration is done, and how routing is done. So first of all, initializing a new project is pretty straightforward, I would say. You create a new directory, you type npm init.astro, install the dependencies, and then start the dev server. We will do that in a minute. But first, let's look into the project structure. So I will open a starter template, which I prepared already. Let me shortly arrange this. And while explaining the project structure, I will create a new Astro meetup project. And we'll initialize Astro. So when initializing Astro, it first will ask you which template you want to start with. For this demo, I will start with a minimal setup and use the starter kit generic. So while that is initializing, let's look at the project structure of Astro. And here we see that the project of Astro, or a project of Astro, has a real clean and simple layout. You mainly have an Astro config file, which brings variables that you can set, but you don't need to do anything here when you start developing. Then you have a public folder where you can place static files like assets, CSS, robots.txt, images. And then the main folder that we were looking for today is the source folder. The pages folder is mainly the entry point for the application and the pages that will be generated in the end. And components will be a folder for something like a header, navigation bar, sidebar, and so on. So that's the short structure of Astro. Close that. We'll install the dependencies now. And while the dependencies are installing, let's look what Astro files are. So Astro files, they have the Astro extension, and they can be pages and they can be components. By default, you can just put HTML in there, and they are reachable as a full page. But to enrich Astro files, you can add a front meta script section at the top of the file to have more dynamic content within the file. And then you can use JSX for templating. So when you are preparing variables in the front meta script section, you can use these and access these with JSX. I'd like to show this now. The project is already initialized. Shortly arrange my screens. And prepare the server. So when Astro starts up, it first caches all the libraries that could be possibly done there. For example, you see Vue.js being downloaded here. And that's only done on the first startup. Later on, this is already cached in the node modules folder. So now let's start with a meetup page. I got an error message because I still have another server running. So I'll just stop that and restart that again. And again, let's start with our meetup page, which I'd like to set up as a basic HTML page first. I prepared a really minimal, small HTML here, and we see that Astro also already recognizes file changes. So let's access this meetup page now. That worked properly. So this is already a pretty simple example, but yeah. So now let's add a front meta script section here. And as you see, we have a repetitive title. And I'd like to put that in a variable. Sorry. And with JSX, I can easily output this here. Let's see if that worked. And I will just change the headline also, that we see that that changed. Fine. So now I'd like to add some basic data about a meetup. I will create a small div here and print out some basic info. Out of this part, I will now create an Astro component. And Astro components are the same like pages. I create a meetup event Astro component and paste the static part in here. So now I'd like to render this component. I will be importing it. And also give it a little change here so that we see that this works also properly. Yeah, that's nice. So now let's make this a little bit more dynamic. As said before, so first of all, I'd like to make this component dynamic. So I prepared the component same with the variables that I did here with the headline variable. I prepared a component which has 3 variables, and these act as props for the component. So I provided the variables which are exported for the component, and they will be printed in here. And now to test this component, I will provide a test title at first. Yeah, that looks fine as well. So now I've got some data that I'd like to render. So this project structure is the minimal structure. There's some conventions, for example, that I can create a data folder, and in here I will place my JSON file, which contains events from the meetup API. For example, the meetup today. And now I'd like to render this data on the meetup page. For that, I'm importing the meetup data as events from the data folder. And then I can iterate over these events. I can use normal JavaScript functions here and render the component with a particular title of the event. It's event.name. That worked as well. So to speed up this a little bit, I also have, as the component has more parameters, I've prepared this already so that we directly see all the information. For sure, you could also just provide the event object to the meetup component, but as a demonstration, I wanted to show this like this. So this also works as expected. So that's it for the part of Astro using pages and components. Let's go back to the presentation. Now I'd like to show something about the Markdown support of Astro. So Astro comes with out-of-the-box support for GitHub flavored Markdown, for example, for to-do lists, with syntax highlighting and with footnotes. And yeah, so let's create a Markdown file and see how we can render this with Astro. I also prepared a Markdown file to be served by the Astro server. And we will create that in the pages folder. So this will be our event Markdown file. And I pasted it with a small front matter part as well. Let's see if that serves well. Looks good, but it doesn't have any layout for now. So how can we render this part in the meetup page that we just created? So for Markdown files, we can add a layout in the front matter section. And I will create a new folder, layouts, which contains a default layout, and reference it in the front matter part of the Markdown. To use the layout of the meetup page, I will create now my folder, put in that file, and now I will clean that up a little bit. First of all, I don't like to render events in that page. I provide a slot where the Markdown should be rendered. And then I don't need the headline. I just need to provide an attribute called content. And this is some kind of magic attribute which provides access to the front matter section of the Markdown file so that I can access the title attribute in here. Let's see how that looks like. Yeah, nice. That's how I expected it to work. So with Markdown footnotes, you have possibilities like this, even if this style is not so nice here. Like this is generated out of the box from Markdown, and you have syntax highlighting for really many languages. And as said, also for the to-do lists. Let's come back to the slide. So Markdown support out of the box. We will see another Markdown example later on. Let's continue. So at the start, I talked about an island architecture. So what is an island architecture? The island architecture term is coined by Jason Miller, which is the creator of Preact. And the idea is here that you render pages, HTML pages on the server, mainly static. And then you have these placeholders which you see here, like the header apps, the sidebar apps, and the image carousel app, which you mark as dynamic paths, let's say. And the idea is here that these placeholders are also rendered on the server side, and at some point will be hydrated on the client side. So client-side logic is executed on the client side. And another idea is here that these slots don't interfere each other. They are non-blocking to each other, and they provide for the main part of the page the best rendering performance. So how does Astro implement this island architecture? It's done by using partial hydration. And partial hydration adds something to the syntax, which we will see soon. But until now, we didn't see Vue, right? So where's Vue? Let's create a component. And what I'd like to add now to our meetup landing page is a more interactive version of our event component. So I'd like to have a component like this, but with the possibility to give thumbs up and thumbs down. So for that, I've prepared a Vue component. Let me grab the code for that. And I will create a meetup event Vue component in here. Paste my code. And shortly explain what happens here. So we have the same props as in Astro, but this time with Vue syntax. We added buttons with the methods bound to increase and decrease, or to increase thumbs up and thumbs down, show the value of the sums. So we have data, we have a computed property, which is all working fine. And now I'd like to import this component and use it. So for the Vue component, I will only render one event. So I'll take the same properties here, and I have to access only the first part. Should be fine. And let's see if this renders properly. Remember, I didn't configure anything in the project to tell that I wanted to use Vue now. I just created my Vue component, imported it, and used it. And it's the same with React or Svelte. So that's really something I like about Astro. So now let's look what the Vue component can do. It's not working. So why is it not working? Let me check and explain. When looking at the network tab, let's see what is transferred to the browser currently. There's 0 JavaScript. So even the Vue component is rendered on the server side by default. Now I'd like to opt into the client-side logic. I want to have the Vue component really rendered on the client side and execute logic. So what I add is this, I talked about the modifier, and we see the 3 available modifiers here. I add the load modifier, and that says the Vue component should be hydrated after page load. So let's refresh. And there we go. Vue is fetched and loaded, and my component works as expected. Then there's another modifier, which is called idle. This is meant to be used when you want to, it's based on a more experimental browser feature currently, which is request idle callback, if I'm not mistaken. And this mainly marks this rendering of the page as a background task and will slowly render it. So it says the other part of the page should be prioritized for loading. But what's really nice is the visible modifier. The visible modifier is something that we see now. So there's small JavaScript served now, but no Vue component. And as soon as I scroll down, the Vue component is loaded. So that gives really the power for the developer to tell, okay, I can decide at which point something is loaded, and I can really opt in into stuff. Then with Vue components, they can be even rendered in another part. And now I'm coming back to a Markdown example. To render Markdown in here, I can import an out-of-the-box component of Astro. And I will create that here. And I will take some part of this Markdown here and put it in the Markdown section. Let's see if this renders properly. Yeah, looks good. So you might know something, a framework like MDX or MDSVEX, I think. And the concept here is out of the box, Astro also provides something like this. So I can even use this Vue component and put it inside this Markdown part. And then the Vue component renders inside the Markdown part and works as expected. And even the modifier with visibility works. So that's something I really like about Vue, and that's also something that provides for certain development projects where you have document pages. You can really have a documentation and below an interactive component rendered. Documentation written with Markdown, for example. Yeah. So that's the Vue part. Let's go back to the presentation. I'd like to talk about routing a little bit. I think you already saw how routing works, but I want to summarize it a little bit. So at first you have these entry points. They are Astro pages or Markdown pages, which can have a layout. And then you can decide, do you want to have server-side rendering with Astro, with React, with Svelte, with Vue, as you saw? And inside Astro components, you can also nest components with modifiers. I think it's also planned in the future to have nested components in here. I think, but that doesn't currently work. What you also can do, as you saw in my demo, is that you have an Astro page and directly render these components with the modifiers. And this is a thing that I requested already to the framework, and I think that's also on the roadmap. At some point, there should be also components which are only client-side rendering, and that should also serve as a path for people who have a single-page application, want to migrate it to Astro, so that they can first drop it in and split it, and optimize the rendering in the end. That's all to be discussed if that happens. So this was just an idea of myself. So let's come to other features I want you to know about. Astro provides a collections API. And what this does is, in the end, if you have a folder of Markdown files, with the collections API, you can fetch these Markdown files. And the collections API provides an object where you can right away provide a pagination out of it. You get the next and previous URLs generated and get a total amount of pages. And this should also work with remote data in the future. Astro has also Tailwind support out of the box. You need to install it locally with npm, add an Astro config, and add a Tailwind config, and add that to the Astro config, and then you are good to go. Also needed for SEO, it's good that Astro provides the generation of a sitemap XML. And Astro provides also to use state libraries. I myself didn't use them until now. there's definitely a challenge because in the end, the components that are rendered on the page, they are basically different Vue apps. And now we need to inject the Vuex store to these apps. So this should be handled by the framework at some point and will be improved in the future. And then there's styling, which I also didn't go into that deep today. But there's the possibility of having global CSS with a link tag, for example, like I did it today, mainly for the syntax highlighting and the minimal layout. But if you use the style tag within components, you get scoped CSS by default in all types of components. And if you provide a sass at lang attribute in the style tag, you can also use sass. So that's also possible. And for React and Preact Vue, you can use CSS modules. Let's talk about the future. So Astro is currently positioned as a static site generator, as said, but then there's much change. And currently, the out-of-the-box frameworks you saw, there's Vue, Svelte, React, and Preact, but there are many feature requests for supporting more libraries. How that's done is currently a question. I guess these frameworks that I mentioned just some minutes ago will be staying out of the box, and the others might be added as plugins so that you can also add these through some kind of configuration. And also currently discussed is something to provide a mechanism like having still a server-side mechanism where HTML pages are created on request. So that would enrich the possibilities for the developer to decide which part of your web application, of your web page is really dynamic, which is static. And then there's also the request for named slots to, until now, we only have one slot to render the Markdown in. And also with image support, I can already render images, but with image support, I mean, you can, in all these other static frameworks, you have also image optimization and yeah, a pipeline for creating web optimized images. So that's also all discussed currently. And one feature request was also because Tailwind is, in my opinion, currently the most known utility CSS framework. There's also a feature request for Windy CSS. And that's it, what I wanted to talk about today about Astro. So the resources here, the welcome page that you saw today is based on the Astro.build page because I really like that the stars floating around, and you can visit the GitHub repo. The main documentation is currently there, but currently the Discord community works on providing a proper documentation as a page. And there you can follow Astro on Twitter. There's also a CSS Tricks article about Astro, and I can only encourage you to join the Discord. If you're interested in this technology, you want to provide ideas, you need help to set up your project, join the Discord channel. And there are already some showcases. So these are pages that you can look at later on, which already use Astro. So thank you for listening. I hope you liked the presentation today, and now I'm open for feedback, questions, and hope we can have an open discussion. And regarding dynamic content, you already can import dynamic content. And the question is, when do you need the dynamic content? If the dynamic content is, for example, from an API, when you generate your website, that's already possible. And currently, there's a little bit of challenging implementation if you want your client-side components also fetching data from the API, but this is still possible. Technically, it's not yet solved from Astro itself. Like it would be a nice developer experience, but it's possible. So you can already have dynamic data on your page with these slots. Just to show you an example with remote data. So it's dynamic data, and let me just yeah, it's getting data for a certain city. It's weather data. And to come back to your question again, as soon as the weather data changes, you would need to regenerate your page again. That's the, let's say, bad thing about static site generation. But you could also implement this as a client-side component, and then this is already always showing the actual weather data. So this would be the weather component, and let's import it. I started the building process. To start the server again. And see, you see the data. We can also have shortly a look on the original data. I think it's really copy and paste. I really copy and pasted the example from meta weather, and this is for which city? I think for London, if I'm not mistaken. That's a good example for remote data. So as you, in the end, whenever you build a web page with static site generation, you need to know when your data changes and regenerate your page if you want to have that actual data rendered on the page. Basically, every file on the pages folder will be an HTML file, and whatever JavaScript framework you import. So for my project, only Vue.js would be put into the distribution folder. So basically that's it. Let me think about this. I mean, as it's first, the goal at first is HTML, so zero JavaScript. But at the moment, I can't think of anything that I couldn't solve this. When you think about all these static site generators, you always know, okay, maybe this thing I can implement better with this tool. And for example, one thing which would be more like some kind of where you need to organize your own source code in the end, and Astro doesn't provide a solution for it. For example, when I now request remote data from an API, I can do this in the front meta part as well with an await fetch, and I get the data. I also have a weather component which fetches JSON data, and this is totally fine to be rendered. I think when it comes to configuring an API where you have also authentication, it's your job to encapsulate this in a way that you can handle it. So for now, for example, when I compare this to GridSum, you have multiple plugins where you always have configuration objects that you put in one file, and there's no direction here, and you're free to do this. So until now, the only limitation that I saw was more like finding things that are currently sometimes still a little bit buggy because the GitHub repo was published 1 week ago. I'm also happy that it was published before my talk because I didn't expect this. And to be honest, yeah, I think for now I don't see a boundary. With all static site generators, I wouldn't right now build a big company's e-commerce shop maybe, but having mid-size sites where you also can plug in external cards would still be fine in my opinion. So you can still, when you integrate now third-party libraries, it can still lead to, I would say, it can still lead to bugs, but yeah, I think that will be, the framework will get major and then it's doable. Yeah. And one thing that also I'd like to mention, because this front meta part here, that's something because I thought, okay, if I can import things here, I can also import node modules. That's currently not possible in this part. And there's a decision, this decision is done because Astro doesn't want to currently bind itself or make an assumption about the runtime where Astro runs. So it wants to be able to be run on Dino, for example, at some point, or in some serverless environments. And but that's all to evolve. And the idea to be runtime agnostic is really good. So I think currently it's basically Vue 3. Regarding the other frameworks, I don't know the versions. Yeah. So what Astro does for these frameworks in general, Astro has a generic interface for renderers. So you have a server-side renderer and you have a client-side renderer. And for all these 4 frameworks, Astro provides them out of the box. And in the end, I think all the Vue static site generators use the Vue server-side rendering library. And this is also used in Astro. So all the feature requests, also there's a feature request regarding Angular currently, and also for lit SSR, I think, to render web components on the server side. So my guess is that that will really be extended, and this integration will get more and more stable. For example, the client only side rendering influences this interface, and I think it's tricky to implement, but I think there will be a solution. And yeah, I think there's already an Astro extension which I have installed here, and it's also part of the GitHub repo, if I'm not mistaken. So there's this extension, and there's also a prettier plugin, but I didn't try that out. So I built a page for a company based on Gritsum. And what I currently recognize is that Gritsum is since a long time not updated. I think they want to take care of this project in the future as well, because currently it's a really stable version. But I'd like to port the Gritsum website to Astro as soon as the image optimization part is in there, because for the company there are bigger images and I'd like to have them being automatically optimized by Astro. So that's my plan. And also in that page, especially I've a contact form, for example, where I need exactly that little island that connects to a backend. I mean, they're also out of the box JavaScript frameworks, but at the later stage, I plan to have another island and another island. And so this, I think this will be perfect for that company page. So I've planned that. And maybe I will first, until that, start with an own small blog, or yeah. I also try to contribute to the documentation of Astro, which is also built on Astro itself then.